sooner than later and cause it to clog up. And the reason you want to start with using just air and not paint is if you release paint first and then press down the air button, you will have paint lying in your nozzle, and when you press down the air, it will spray out a splatter of paint on your beautiful miniature and probably ruin your paint job. So make sure to always start and end with air. You can also control the area which your airbrush is spraying the paint. If you move closer, you have a smaller spread of the paint, and if you move back your airbrush, you have a bigger spread of the paint. The first time you're getting used to an airbrush, a good idea is to paint some circles and some lines to practice your aim, your hand-eye coordination, and also get a feel for air pressure and paint release. Just by doing this a couple of times on a piece of paper, you will get a good feel for how the airbrush feels and how the spread is of the paint. So where do you start with the air pressure? My recommendation is to start around 20 psi or 1.5 bar. But there are a couple of different factors that can cause you to have to change the pressure of air. When painting closer to your subject, 20 might be a bit too high, causing something called spider webbing. This spider webbing can be caused because of two reasons. Either because you have a too high air pressure, or maybe you release a bit too much paint in one go. So you lowered your air pressure and you don't get spider webbing anymore, but you start getting something called speckling. This is because your paint isn't thin enough. Adding a few drops of water or thinner will solve this problem for you. And sometimes, instead of lowering your air pressure, you might have to increase it. If you're getting speckling, even though you're spraying from a bit further away, and your dilution when you were spraying close to the miniature was perfect, but now you're painting a bit further away, so you might have to increase the pressure of the air again. Okay, Emil, but wait, you talked about you have to thin your paints. Wait. Thinning your paints. I touched on this subject just a few seconds ago, and thinning your paints might actually be one of the main keys to success when painting miniatures. You can do this in many different ways. Some people like to buy pre-thinned paints from Vallejo or Games Workshop. Others pre-thin their paints in bottles and have it ready when it's time to paint. Others do it in a cup when they start painting. My personal favorite ways of thinning and mixing my paints is to do it in the airbrush cup when I'm about to paint. This way I cut out all the extra steps for me to get started when painting, and if you know me, I just want to have fun when I paint, so this is what works for me. I do this by adding a couple of drops of thinner, or if you live in Sweden or a place with really good water, you can just add a couple of drops of water into the cup of the airbrush. I start with the thinner or water because you don't want the paint to fall into the tube of the airbrush, because it will be a lot harder to clean it later. I then add a few drops of paint into the cup. I stir it around with a large old brush. You don't want to use your new expensive Raphael brush. You want to use a cheap one because this might mess up your brush a bit. And when I mixed it up in the cup, I covered the nozzle of my airbrush. I moved the lever back and down to create a backflow in the cup. This mixes the paint properly in my cup, and as I mentioned, it cuts me a couple of extra steps when painting, and I don't have to buy hundreds of special airbrush paints that I'm just using for airbrushing. The right mix will vary from paint to paint, so you might have to try for yourself and experiment a bit what works for your paint. As a rule of thumb, you want your paint to have a consistency of skimmed milk. I don't know if that helps, but it's supposed to be watery and kind of run down from the edge of your cup, but not too thin, and you just have to try it out and figure what works for you. And it takes a few times to get the hang of. Maybe you will clog your airbrush up a few times before you nail your perfect consistency, but it's totally worth it in the long run to learn how to mix the paints in the cup. So you bought an airbrush, you started it up, you mixed your paints and started airbrushing, and now you need to clean it. Let's talk about something you should actually do before you start painting with your airbrush. I recommend you to pull the airbrush apart and see what all the parts are, where they fit and how your airbrush is constructed. Get a feel for which part goes where and what function they actually have on your airbrush. And why you should do this is because when you start painting, if you get a clog or when you start cleaning, you don't understand where the bits go, you're in a bit of a trouble. So getting a good feel for your airbrush will really help you in the long run again. And what this has to do with cleaning, we'll touch on that in a bit. And if you watched an airbrush video before, you've probably seen at least a couple of different ways of cleaning your airbrush, and everyone swears by different ways of cleaning your airbrush. And most ways are totally fine, but now I'm going to share with you what I've learned, what I found works the best, and what saves me the most time when painting, but keeps my airbrush at a high level and keeps it from breaking. So you're spraying with different paints and you want to clean it up a bit before adding the new paint. You pour the excess in your cup into a garbage bin or container. You then take a bit of water into the cup, give it some backflow again as you did when you mixed the paints. You empty the cup and spray out all the excess that's left in your nozzle. When I've done that, I take some paper and clean the inside of the cup to remove all the paint that's in the cup. You then repeat this process again. You probably won't have to use the paper, but you add the water, you give it a backflow, you spray out the nozzle, and you empty it. You might have to do this 2 or 3 times for all the paint to be removed from the cup and the inside of your airbrush. So when you don't see any paint in your cup when doing the backflow and you spray with your airbrush on a piece of paper and it's completely clear, you're all done. This is something you need to get a good routine of doing, and if you get a good routine, it will be a super fast process and you can move from one paint to the other quickly without having to stop. And the better your airbrush hygiene is while painting, the longer your airbrush will last and you'll have a more consistent result from it. And the next thing we need to discuss is when you're finished for the day. So what I do is I clean it up the way I did in between every paint. I then fill it with a bit of airbrush cleaner. I then take a Q-tip and dip it around in the cleaner in the cup and stir it around to clean the inside of the airbrush. I then spin it around the tip of the needle to clean the needle top. I then pull the lever back to pull the needle all the way into the airbrush. And then push the Q-tip around to clean the nozzle and the air regulator of the airbrush. Make sure to do this properly, push it around, stir it around a bit, maybe push down the lever to get some backflow again. And you want to do this because you don't want any paint to be stuck between the nozzle and the air regulator. Press down the lever to push some air through the regulator, and this way you remove any excess paints or any excess airbrush cleaner. And if you don't do this properly, you will have paint dried up in both your nozzle and your air regulator. And if you have that, you will either clog up your airbrush or get an uneven flow of air, and your paint will become speckly, will just ruin your miniatures. So make sure to have a good airbrush hygiene. It's one of the most important things when using an airbrush, and getting a good routine for that, because if you don't, you're gonna ruin your miniatures by having an uneven flow from your airbrush. And once in a while, this won't happen too often if you take care of your airbrush, but once in a while, your airbrush will clog up. Either you forgot some paints in it, or you didn't clean it properly, or maybe some of your paints had particles in it that's a bit too thick to spray out of your nozzle. And when this happens, you have to pull your airbrush apart again and clean it thoroughly. This is not something you should have to do every time you're using your airbrush, and pulling it apart and cleaning it too many times might create micro scratches and ruin your airbrush in the long run. It will lessen your performance quite quickly if you do this every day. So just do this when you really have to. I found that most of the times when I have a problem, it sits either in the needle, the nozzle, or the air regulator. You remove the needle from the airbrush, take a bit of paper and soak it with a bit of airbrush cleaner. You then clean the needle by moving the paper in the direction of the needle. You don't want to go back and forth because it's super easy to destroy the tip of the needle, so just move it the same way as the air flows on the needle, from the bottom and up. And this is also where we use the interdental brushes I talked about earlier. If you dip them in some airbrush cleaner, you can clean the inside of your nozzle and the air regulator. If you get an interdental brush made out of metal, be incredibly careful so you don't scratch the inside of the nozzle. And sometimes you find a lot of dried up paint in your nozzle. Then you might have to go in with the tip of your needle as well. Don't push your needle into the insides of the nozzle. Put it in gently into the center and then push the sides of the needle around to scrape off the paints inside the nozzle. You will feel quite instantly if you have dried up paint in your nozzle. Just make sure to scrape it off using the side of your needle, not the tip. And be incredibly careful when doing this because you don't want to damage the tip of your needle and have to buy a new needle. And when you scrape it off the sides of the nozzle, just push it through the tip of your nozzle, and then take my Q-tip, dip it in some airbrush cleaner, and then clean the inside of the cup and the inside of the airbrush. If this is not enough to solve your problems, using the interdental brushes going into the airbrush again, and just pick it apart and clean every part this way. But these first steps should be way enough if you're taking care of your airbrush. These are just the beginning steps of your airbrush painting journey. And in the future, I will be doing another video using the airbrush. I will be going more into detail. I will be showing you some tips and tricks that I've learned through my time using an airbrush. So just hit the subscribe button if you want to see that in the future. I also release new videos every week, so make sure to subscribe for hobby tips, painting tutorials, or just fun times with hobbies. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment if you have any questions. Share it with a friend if you have someone who might learn something from watching this video. And with that said, guys, have a great day. Bye. Oh, I almost forgot. This video, by the way, is sponsored by my Patreon supporters. They're the main reasons why I can do these videos. And if you feel like you learned something from this video, or maybe just had a bit of fun watching me do stuff with hobby, consider pledging a few dollars to help me run this channel and do these videos and create content for you. Thank you all Patreon supporters for supporting this channel. Special thanks to this week's new $10+ supporters, Timothy Renshaw and Neil Otter. Also, once again, a shout out to my top Patreon supporter, Albin Ostrom. The airbrush is essentially just another painting tool in your arsenal of painting tools. Where the paint appears in the cup, you push in air through the bottom of the airbrush and force them both to the front to get the nice smooth spray of paint. And not only do they give you a really nice flow, but with the right airbrush workflow, you can get a really nice smooth finish to your paint job, speed up your painting process by probably 3-4 times, and get even more vibrant colors than you do today. And using an airbrush should never fully replace the work you do with a regular paintbrush. It should complement it. It's quite similar to how a screwdriver doesn't replace the work the hammer does. It just speeds things up and can be used for a couple of things that the hammer can't do. In its essence, it's a complement to the brush. Most of the things I will talk about today will be through the eyes of a miniature painter, because that's what I am. But even as an artist painting on a canvas, or maybe a tractor or a hockey helmet, you'll be able to get something from this video, as a ton of these tips are applicable across all hobbies. The biggest improvement and the biggest thing that airbrush unlocked for me is how it's made painting my Warhammer armies way more bearable and cuts down my army painting time by at least 80%. And when I do my high-end paint jobs, not only does it speed up the painting process, but it also helps me get a paint job that's a lot smoother, and it helps me get the general shapes of the paint job way more accurate than it does when I paint everything with just a regular brush. And of course, at a way higher speed. Chapter B. What should I buy and what do I need to get started? There are 3 main things that you need to pick up to get started with your airbrushing. The first and obvious one, an airbrush. But you also need a compressor and a hose that leads between the compressor and the airbrush. So let's get started on which airbrush you should buy, because as a beginner, it can be quite overwhelming to pick the right one. And most all airbrushes are good at least one thing. When painting miniatures and scale models like I do, the gravity-feed dual-action airbrush tends to be the way to go. This is the most common airbrush, and just like the name infers, the paint is being forced down with gravity to the front of the airbrush and then pushed out with air. And dual feed means that you can control the airflow and the amount of paint released through the airbrush separately. By pushing down the trigger, you introduce air to the airbrush, and by pulling back the trigger, you release the paint. And the further back you pull it, the more paint is released through the bottom of the airbrush. And this is the order you should always do things, putting down the air first and then releasing the paint. I will talk more about that in just a second. There are tons of different airbrushes to pick from the super cheap Chinese no-brand airbrushes, to the decent low-price airbrushes like Sparmax and Badger, to the mid-range and high-end airbrushes like Iwata and Hardware and Steenbeck. And all these airbrush brands are to some extent a precision tool. But to make things easier for you, I'm going to categorize them from my personal experience using all these kinds of airbrushes, and then let you know which airbrush I think you should pick up depending on where you are in your airbrush journey. Let's start with the cheap, no-name brands you can get off Wish or Amazon. This is two airbrushes from Wish. This one costs $50 with a compressor, and this one costs $15. In my personal opinion, this airbrush that we picked up is not a good airbrush because it does not give you a lot of control and it's quite difficult to use. This one, however, did give a decent spray, and for $15 you might think that this is a great beginner airbrush. But let's talk more about that. Because not only is it a 50-50 if you get a good airbrush when you buy these cheap ones, because of the quality control being really subpar. But my main issue with it is that it feels like it's been engineered by someone who doesn't airbrush themselves. They are difficult to clean and difficult to control, and will make a beginner airbrusher just as miserable as a crypto zoo investor. But if you are an experienced painter and want a throwaway airbrush, one that is okay to break, maybe you have stuff where you spray with PVA glue or enamel paints, things that easily break up your finer airbrushes that are a little bit more expensive. This is a perfect airbrush for that type of use, where you maybe don't need the best control, you just need something that doesn't matter if it breaks. So it does have a great purpose. So to summarize, a great tool for a very specific user at a very low cost. It's time to jump on to our next category, and this is the kind of low-priced, mid-range airbrushes from more serious airbrush manufacturers. On the cheaper lower end, we have Sparmax and Badger, and then to the more mid-range, we have the cheaper versions from Iwata and Hartman Steenbeck. And the last one named, I'm quite biased about because we are sponsored by Hartman Steenbeck. But 100% transparency, this is also the brand that I used way before I started this YouTube channel and started collaborating with them as a brand. And all these airbrush brands make at least decent airbrushes that will in some ways be good for beginners, because they all spray well and are decently easy to clean. Some may be easier than others, like the Hartman Steenbeck, they have very easy to remove front end, compared to say the Sparmax where you need a tool to remove the nozzle. And normally these cheaper airbrushes are fitted with a 0.4 needle instead of the smaller ones that are 0.2 or 0.15 that are really difficult for a beginner to mix paints with. And having a bigger needle in an airbrush means you have a slightly bigger airflow, making them perfect for the base tasks that a beginner will use. Things like adding your first base coat, priming your miniature, or maybe painting on flat, large surfaces like vehicles or big monsters and giants. And here's a little bit where my bias comes in, because one of the brands, Hartman Steenbeck, have just recently redesigned a cheaper airbrush to be an even better fit for a beginner. Because instead of just making it with cheaper materials, they've changed